Hi, and welcome back to the History Hut. I'm Jim, this is Dr. K, and today we'll be talking about Charlemagne and the Carolingians. Two very fun words to say. First off,
Charlemagne's good.
Yeah, Carolingians also quite good.
I could call you James the Great.
That's pretty good, yeah.
James Maine or something.
But enough fooling around.
Enough.
Let's look at the rise of the Carolingians. These guys are the mayors of the palace guys, right?
That's right. We were talking about that last time. So we've got a number of people. We talked about Pepin II dying in 714, and then Charles the Hammer Martel dying in 741, and Pepin the Short 768. Charlemagne dying in 814, and then his son Louis the Pious, so we'll be talking about in another episode, dying in 840. And all of them divide up the land the way the Merovingians had. So, you know, they don't learn every lesson there is. But I mean, it's not even really straightforward for them when they come to the throne, even though they're coming as mayors of the palace, because they're actually trying to hold that position to make that position hereditary for them. And they have lots of kids, and of course that's an issue always. We've seen that. You know, what do you do when you've got lots of heirs? So, for instance, Pepin II, and I have to mention his wife's name because it's so cool, Plectrude. Sounds like you're playing a guitar. Get me Plectrude, and we'll have some songs. So he doesn't actually leave the throne to his sons or the sons of his sons by his wife. He leaves the throne, or the mayor of the palace job, to his illegitimate son Charles the Hammer Martel. So he takes over as mayor of the palace, and then he keeps the throne or the top position for his sons. And he has 3 sons. He has 2 by his first wife, and I think 1 by his second wife. And when Charles the Hammer Martel died, he split the kingdom between only 2 of the 3 sons, Charlemagne and Pepin. And then the son that's left out, of course, challenges, and there's a violent challenge, and it causes all sorts of problems. And then the first son, who had been, you know, given half the kingdom, turns all religious, and so the second son, Pepin the Short, controls the leadership and really controls everything. And in turn, he has 2 sons, Carloman and Charles, or our boy Charlemagne, Charles the Great, and divides the land equally between them. But Carloman dies quickly and suddenly after the handover, and Charles, or Charlemagne, gets it all. And so, you know, just by sheer chance, by sheer luck perhaps, or maybe in mysterious circumstances, Charlemagne gets the entire empire. And if you thought that was a tough way to get it, you know, with the illegitimate sons and the legitimate sons, if you look at Charlemagne, and you don't think of this because we think of him as a Christian king, and so of course monogamous. Not the case at all. So Charlemagne had, and I'll just give you 5 wives and 5 mistresses, and he had, you know, in total 17 children by his 5 wives and 5 mistresses. Now, his first wife, from his first wife, he gets Pepin, but he's hunchback. Remember, kings can't usually, you can't be the heir if there's anything kind of physically wrong with you. So he's disinherited, and he becomes a monk. So he's born in 769. The second wife is the daughter of the king of the Lombards, and of course, as we'll see, Charlemagne falls out with the Lombards and takes down their entire kingdom, and then just as an extra bitch slap, sends the wife back. It's like, yeah, I've taken your kingdom, you can just take your wife back, I don't want her anymore. And so that's annulled, so there's no kids from that. Wife 3, you get Charles, who'll become king of the Franks, Pepin, king of Italy, and Louis, who'll eventually become the sole heir, and 6 more kids. Then the 4th wife, a daughter who's an abbess. The 5th wife, no kids. And then the mistresses, 1 son's a cleric, 2nd mistress, son a cleric, 3rd mistress, daughter who's an abbess, 4th mistress, a daughter, and a 5th mistress, a son who's a bishop, and a son who's an abbot. So you've got like tons of kids all over the place. And the really cool thing I think about Charlemagne is that he insists that his daughters get the same education as his sons, and they're all really well educated. And as we'll see later on, they function as a kind of joint advisory board to him. So he keeps them at court, and he calls on them for their advice. So it's kind of a very kind of interesting, charismatic, big, tall, handsome sort of kingly king.
A kingly king.
A kingly king. So he's the that's how they come through the mayor of the palace to take over as the actual rulers.
What are some of the characteristics of Charlemagne's rule besides the obvious, you know, wives, kids, and mistresses?
Obvious dalliance. It's interesting because although he becomes really, really wealthy, he never dresses like a kingly king. He dresses in Frankish cloaks, and his palace is actually quite plain, but he's got, you know, like all these irons in the fire, as it were. If you were looking at the characteristics of his rule, most historians, including myself, would point to probably three things. It's militarism, the marriage of church and state, and the Carolingian Renaissance, a little rebirth of interest in knowledge that we'll talk about. So the first one is the militarism. And he has a very small army of about 8,000, but in the field all the time, a lesson well learned by other rulers in other places as well. So he actually goes on 54 campaigns between 768 and 804. And although he doesn't die until 814, he kind of just stays at home and relaxes after 804. There might still be campaigns, but he's not going out with them. So 54 campaigns, that's a lot, 8,000 men. Always a good idea to keep your men in the field. That way they're busy and they don't have time to complain. So he establishes a thing called the Spanish March, and that's a border between Spanish territory and the south of France, and that's a buffer zone south of the Pyrenees mountain range. And also another one called Ostmark. In the Germanic, you'll notice, the East March, and that's between him and the Slavs in the East. Quite sensible when you consider all the trouble with people coming from the East into Gaul. But the group that gives them the most trouble are the group to the north, the Saxons. The Saxons. And it takes them 3 decades to thrash the Saxons in the north. And of course, he's also going to take out the Lombards in Italy to help out the Pope. And that's about 774. So all of this military action allows for him to build up vast amounts of treasure. And it meant also that he had land to hand out to his followers. So for instance, in his war on the north, Saxony was pagan. And it's seen as a collection of tribal territories, and these tribes all met annually for an assembly. And in 772, Charlemagne set out to sack this area. And what he did was he hit the cult sites first. So he went to all the places where they would go and worship their false gods after him, and took home tons of treasure. So, you know, he was able to do kind of hit and runs into Saxon territory, but it took him 30 years to actually tame the Saxons. And this is likely in the end because the territory was so disunited. You know, if they'd been able to form a united front against him, it would have been different. But even so, they're able to hold him off for 3 decades. So there's lots of violence. For instance, in 782, 4,500 Saxon prisoners were massacred after a Frankish defeat. And of course, he claimed that the conquest was on ideological grounds. He needed to Christianize them, and he actually brings sweeping changes to the territory and to the people by giving Saxon aristocrats land ownership rights and endowing the Saxon church system. But nonetheless, they cause him a lot of problems. Also, the war against the Lombards. In 773, Pope Hadrian asked Charlemagne for help, and not only did he help, but he totally annexed the Lombard kingdom. And the Lombards had a centralized kingdom with Pavia as its capital, and he had to lay siege to different towns for, you know, like 6 months at a time. So it's quite the campaign. But the great thing is that the wealth, I mean, they're incredibly wealthy. Remember we talked about the Lombards handing out passports for people moving in and out of Rome for pilgrimages. So they have incredible amount of wealth, and he brings it back to his court at Aachen, or Aix-la-Chapelle. And he actually kept the Italian territory separate from his Frankish kingdom, and he ruled it as king of the Franks and the Lombards. And in 781, he sent his son Pepin to rule there as a subordinate king. And one of the arguments is that not only does he get incredible wealth from the Lombards, but because this had been such a well-organized state, that he gets an incredible, it's an incredible source of government expertise for the Carolingians. They really learn how to run their own kingdom through this Lombard example. There's some other examples. In the 790s, he's at war with the Avars, and they're still really powerful. Their headquarters are at the Ring on the Hungarian plains, and this brings immense amounts of, again, treasure, booty, loot into the Frankish kingdom. And it's a little quote from Einhard, his biographer: "No one could recall any war that left them richer or better stocked with resources." And he's not actually able to take out the Avars, but they do remain kind of on the edge of his kingdom. By 804, his land holdings were 50% more than in 768 when he takes over, and twice as large as that ruled by Charles Martel. So just incredibly successful when it comes to this militarism. The second characteristic, of course, is the bond with the church. So this marriage of church and state, which is vitally important. So in Rome, again, the Pope is worried about the Lombards and Lombard aggression, and the Pope, kind of jealously guarding his own territory, which is much larger than the papal state today, of course. But when Charlemagne defeats the Lombards for the Pope, he in effect becomes the defender of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. The church is worried about a number of things. It's worried about the Lombards, but it's also worried about Byzantine influence, because the Byzantine church still held territory in Italy, and it didn't want to end up like the Byzantine church, a department of state, really. So in response to Charlemagne doing them this great favor, the Pope makes Charlemagne the Holy Roman Emperor. He comes to Rome. He's not sure, like, if he said to his sons afterwards, had he known that this was what was in store for him, he wouldn't have allowed it, because it would have been better for the Pope to have come to him, to have crossed the mountains as they did earlier on for Pepin's, Pope Stephen, to have crossed the mountains and come to him, than for him to be seen going to Rome and then being crowned by the Pope as, and it's not just as king, it's as the Holy Roman Emperor. So he in effect is saying, I'm just as good as the Roman Empire, but we're religious about it. Holy Roman Emperor. So he said to his sons that, if he'd known, he wouldn't have done it that way at all, because it made it seem at that moment that the church was more powerful than the state, and you could see why he would, wouldn't be happy about that at all. Nonetheless, that's what happens. He's crowned Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in the year 800, and he spends most of his time, when he's not on campaign, of course, at Aachen, which is in the Meuse Valley near the Rhine. So the marriage of church and state, absolute. And remember we talked about this before, because the Carolingians had come up through a secular position, mayor of the palace. It was more important for them. They couldn't claim a kind of direct divine connection. It's more important for them to use the church than ever before. So that absolute solid as a rock. The third characteristic is the Carolingian Renaissance. This is a conscious attempt to gather in the classical learning of Rome and Greece, and classical learning from wherever they happen to conquer. So anywhere they go, they bring in treasure, but for them, treasure is also books and knowledge. And what they do is they try to preserve the knowledge of the classical world, and they recopy texts to pass on to the next generation. So it's, when we think of Renaissance, we think of a rebirth or a really creative period. This isn't necessarily a creative period at all. It is just an era when little is being recorded of their own lives, and little being recorded except by the monks. We talked about writing never really dying out, because you have that the monks washing through Europe. But following the lead of the Irish monks, Charlemagne gathered the top religious scholars of his time, and just kind of sent out the invite, hey, come to my cool palace at Aachen. You can work on whatever you want. And so they do. There's all sorts of them come to his place. Now, if we were just doing a European history kind of survey, and we weren't talking about the rest of the world, what we would say at this point is that 80% of what we know from the classical world, we know from the material that was recopied at the court of Charlemagne, which is fabulous, right? I mean, that's fabulous. But then we also know that there's this recopying's been going on, especially in the Islamic Empire, and it's been gathered in, and it will eventually find its way into the West. But nonetheless, you know, if you are in what you consider to be the Dark Ages and nothing's been written down, and then you find this stash of great stuff, and you want to, I mean, they're recopying everything. They're recopying herbal remedies for illness, you know, from the Romans, all sorts of things. So they also find a new way to produce books, and this is quite creative. So the texts were now written on pages of parchment or sheepskin rather than papyrus. And then they were bound in jeweled covers, these huge, big, you know, just think about the heaviest dictionary you've ever seen, big binding on the outside. But over the top of the binding, it's all carved ivory work, diamonds, rubies, emeralds, absolutely spectacular. In some cases, there are little marble crosses for the crucifixion. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. So ideal for a Christmas present. And of course, they do go out as presents to other rulers. You know,
and if you thought your textbook was expensive as it is now, right. Never mind the diamonds and the ivory.
That's right. It's no wonder they chained them up in the library. Yeah, I mean, just imagine that. Absolutely beautiful. So beautiful inside. It might take a monk a month to copy out one page. It might take them a year to not even complete a book. And then you have the beautiful artwork as well in the margins. So there's the kind of plot line of the Gospels, and then there's the pictures, and this incredibly beautiful binding, and these are called the illuminated manuscripts. So there are about 8,000 manuscripts from this period that survive thanks to the recopying work done at Aachen by the scholars. Charlemagne could read, but he couldn't write, and he insisted that all his children, as I said, including his daughters, receive a really good education, and his sisters as well were all well educated, and usually abbesses too. So he attracts the top scholars to Aachen, including a guy we spoke of before when we were talking about the Dark Ages. We talked about the Venerable Bede, and we talked about Alcuin of York. And Alcuin of York came to the court and set up a school there, and he was actually on a kind of embassy or mission to Rome, and Charlemagne kind of caught wind of that, and on his way back he's like, you know, could you come here? And he seems to have been quite close to him, and for years towards the end of his life, Alcuin kept saying, can I just go home? Can I just go home? And then Charlemagne's like, oh, sorry, the Vikings have plundered York. There's nothing to go home to. Yeah, and then he's like, oh, I still want to go home. And it takes a long time before Charlemagne will actually let him leave the court and kind of, you know, go off somewhere else in France and lead out the last years of his life. So anyway, you get these top scholars at Aachen. Alcuin of York sets up the school. They're doing the paper and the sheepskin method of delivery, and they develop a new form of Latin script which is more readable, and it's called the Caroline minuscule or the Carolingian minuscule, whichever you wish, and you'd recognize it absolutely off the bat as lowercase printing, just ordinary lowercase printing. You know, before they had all the famous you know, Comic Sans MS and all the 1200 fonts that you have, just normal stuff. So you get that too. And Alcuin set up a school for monks, and he had 50 scholars at work producing about 300 books a year. Now you think it's probably how many books a day are produced these days? You know, just terrible.
At least double that.
At least double that. 300 a year. You know, the Gestetner machine rolling them off. And they had to use the skins of entire flocks of sheep for this. It's like little naked sheep stoked around all over the place. Alcuin also wrote treatises on how great Charlemagne was. So it's not all about religion. It's also about kind of, you know, buttering up your ruler. And of course, these help legitimize Charlemagne as the true successor to Rome. And the schools also taught the king's servants. So they taught the bureaucracy, the administration at court, how to read, how to write, how to do their numbers, so they could go out and collect taxes, so they could start to do that kind of record keeping that was so, you know, so needed to run an empire properly, and to build some uniformity into the system. And it meant that Alcuin really creates an educated elite that can carry all this on after he goes.
Well, speaking of carrying on, that does it for part one of our discussion of Charlemagne and the Carolingians.
But
we will carry it on with part two. We'll see you there.